You bend down to pick up a laundry basket you have picked up 1,000 times before, and something in your lower back pops. Not a metaphor. An actual pop, followed by a line of electric fire that runs from your buttock down the back of your thigh into your calf, and you go from standing upright to unable to straighten your spine in about 1 second. Here is the surprising fact I want you to sit with before we go anywhere else. The lift did not cause this injury. It only revealed it. By the time you feel that pop, the damage that produced it was already years old, and in most cases your body had already begun fixing it before you even got to the imaging center. This is not another video telling you to strengthen your core or fix your posture. This is the actual physics and biology of what happens inside a spinal disc when it fails, inside a spinal disc when it fails, why the moment you blame is almost never the real cause, and why the standard conversation you have with a doctor after an MRI usually leaves out the single most useful fact about your own recovery. By the end of this, you will understand exactly why a disc herniates, what your immune system is doing about it right now if you have one, and why the timeline for actually feeling better has almost nothing to do with the day the pain started. Let's start with what the MRI shows, because it is technically accurate and almost completely misleading at the same time. The report says something like disc bulging into the spinal canal, nerve root compressed, herniation. That word herniation gets used the same way you would describe a bone breaking, as if it is purely destruction. And then a conversation about surgery starts. What almost never gets mentioned in that conversation is a number that changes everything. Somewhere around 70% to 80% of herniated discs resolve without surgery at all. Not through willpower, not through rest, but through an active biological clearance process that starts almost immediately and typically finishes within 3 to 12 months. The disc that got presented to you as a structural emergency frozen in a photograph might already be a problem your body is actively solving. Nobody showed you that part of the picture, so let's build it from the ground up. To understand why a disc fails, you first need to understand what a disc actually is, because it is not soft tissue in the way people imagine. It is closer to an engineered pressure vessel. Between every two vertebrae sits a structure with a tough laminated outer wall called the annulus fibrosus, wrapped around a gel-like, water-rich core called the nucleus pumposus. The wall is not a single sheet of material. It is built from 15 to 25 thin concentric layers, and this is where the real elegance shows up. Each layer is made of parallel collagen fibers running at roughly 30 degrees off the horizontal axis of the disc, and here is the key detail. Each successive layer alternates that angle, plus 30, minus 30, plus 30, minus 30, over and over outward. Researchers like Marchand and Amit actually mapped this layered fiber architecture in human spines decades ago, and what they found is functionally identical to something you have held in your hands your entire life: plywood. A single sheet of wood splits easily along the grain. But glue high-do sheets together with the grain running in opposite directions, and suddenly it resists splitting in both directions, because the fibers of one layer bridge the exact weakness of the layer beneath it. Add more layers with alternating angles and you get a composite that is strong in every direction, even though each individual sheet is only strong along one axis. That is exactly the trick your disc uses. Collagen has enormous strength along the direction of its fibers and almost none across it, so evolution solved the same problem plywood manufacturers solved, just several 100 million years earlier. Stack thin weak sheets at alternating angles and the whole becomes strong everywhere. Every time you have snapped a piece of plywood versus a single plank, you have already seen the physics your spine runs on. Now here's a detail that turns this from a nice analogy into something almost eerie. That 30-degree fiber angle is not arbitrary. Engineers have a standard model for anything that is a pressurized tube, whether it is a pipe, a tank, or in this case a disc, and that model tells you that a cylinder under internal pressure experiences twice as much stress going around it, called hoop stress, as it does running along its length. To resist that 2-to-1 stress ratio most efficiently, the optimal fiber angle works out to somewhere around 55 degrees from the long axis of the tube, which is roughly 35 degrees from horizontal. Your disc's actual fiber angle, measured directly in cadaver studies, sits right in that optimal range. Your spine is built to the same specification a mechanical engineer would derive on a whiteboard for a sonorized cylinder, except your body arrived at that number through natural selection instead of a calculator. That is worth pausing on for a second, because it means the disc is not a passive cushion action. It is pressurized architecture. And it really is pressurized, even when you are just standing still doing nothing. Inside the nucleus, the gel core is roughly 80% water, held there by molecules called proteoglycans, the main one being a glycan. Picture a bottle brush. A central protein core with dozens of side chains sticking outward, and along each of those side chains sit sulfate and carboxylate groups that carry a fixed negative electrical charge. Multiply that across the enormous density of a glycan molecules packed into the nucleus, and you get an intense negative charge cloud that pulls positively charged ions in from the surrounding fluid. Wherever ions concentrate, water follows through basic osmotic pressure. That water gets pulled in and held, inflating the nucleus against the annular wall, creating a resting pressure of roughly 1 to 3 atmospheres before you have even stood up in the morning. Your disc is already pressurized like a tire before any weight touches it. That resting tension is actually doing useful work too, because it preloads the annular fibers along their strongest axis, the same way inflating a tire slightly stiffens the sidewall even before the car's weight sits on it. Here's the part most people never think about. That pressure changes dramatically depending on what you're doing, and the numbers are well documented. Classic measurements by the Swedish researcher Alf Nachemsen, taken directly inside human discs under different postures, found standing produces around 6 kilopascals of internal pressure, sitting upright pushes it closer to 900, and bending forward to lift something can drive it up to somewhere between 100 and 200 kilopascals depending on the weight and the angle of your spine. That pressure spreads outward through the fluid core against the laminated wall, converting straight-down compressive force into circumferential tension in the fibers, which is just Pascal's law doing its thing inside a biological container. Pressure applied to a confined fluid pushes equally in every direction. The disc distributes your body weight the way a pressurized tire distributes the weight of a car, spreading a straight load sideways across the whole structure instead of letting it crush one spot. So what happens specifically when you bend forward? This is where the toothpaste analogy comes in, and it is the second and last big analogy I will use in this whole explanation, so hold on to it. When you flex your spine forward, the vertebra above the disc tips forward too, compressing the front edge of the disc. The nucleus is fluid, and fluid cannot be compressed, so it has nowhere to go but backward, exactly like toothpaste getting squeezed toward the cap when you press the tube from the front. That posterior shift sends the pressure toward the back wall of the disc, and here is the cruel design detail. The back of the disc is where the annular wall happens to be thinnest, with the fewest layers and the smallest safety margin. Flexion does not just load the disc more. It specifically routes the extra pressure to the exact spot least equipped to handle it. This is where we get to the actual mechanism of failure, and it is not a single traumatic event, even though it feels like one. It is fatigue, the same kind of fatigue that eventually cracks metal in an airplane wing or a bridge joint after enough repeated stress cycles, long before any single load looks dangerous on paper. Every time you bend forward, every rounded spine lift, every long stretch of sitting with your lower back flattened out, you put a small strain on those posterior fibers. Almost all of those cycles fall inside the elastic range, meaning the fibers stretch slightly and spring back with zero damage. But every so often, a cycle exceeds the local elastic limit at one specific point, and a microscopic tear forms in a single layer. It's too small to feel. It's too small to show up on any scan, but it changes the physics for every layer around it. Here's the aha moment worth sitting with. Once one layer tears, the layers next to it now have to carry the load that torn layer used to share. Stress concentrates right at the tip of the tear, the exact same stress concentration physics that makes a small chip in a windshield eventually spread into a crack across the whole glass. The neighboring layer, now under extra load it wasn't designed to carry alone, tears sooner than it otherwise would have. That layer's neighbor tears sooner too. The damage cascades outward, layer by layer, from the inside of the disc toward its outer surface, across months and years, invisible the entire time. The herniation that shows up during an ordinary lift, a grocery bag, a laundry basket, a kit picked up for the thousandth time, is simply the final layer in a chain reaction that started years before you ever felt anything. The lift was unremarkable. The 3 decades of accumulated flexion cycles before it were the actual engineering cause. Once the wall finally breaches and gel material pushes out into the space around the spinal nerves, a second process kicks in immediately, and this is the part almost nobody explains during that first tense doctor's visit. Your immune system attacks the leaked material like it's a foreign invader, because in a very real sense, it is. The nucleus of your disc develops embryonically from a structure called the notochord, and it gets sealed off from blood supply before your immune system even fully matures. That means the proteins inside a healthy disc's nucleus have literally never been exposed to your immune system, not once, for your entire life. The moment that material breaches the wall and touches vascularized tissue outside the disc, your immune system meets those proteins for the very first time and responds the way it would to any unfamiliar tissue, aggressively. Macrophages, the cleanup cells of your immune system, migrate to the site, attach themselves to the surface of the leaked material, and begin digesting it through a process called phagocytosis, releasing enzymes called matrix metalloproteinases that break the material down piece by piece. But there's an obstacle. The disc has no blood vessels reaching it, so how do enough macrophages get there fast enough to matter? The answer is one of the more remarkable things your body does on the fly. The leaked material triggers signals that recruit endothelial cells from nearby blood vessels, and those cells proliferate and physically build brand new capillary networks growing directly into the herniated material, a process called neovascularization. Your body grows new plumbing specifically to deliver cleanup crews to a location that had zero blood supply for your entire life up to that point. Research by Konya and colleagues published in the Spine Journal documented exactly this mechanism using serial imaging, watching herniations shrink over repeated scans as the immune clearance did its work. Here's a detail that reverses your intuition completely, and it's worth pausing on because it will change how you read your own MRI report if you ever have one. A meta-analysis by Zhang and colleagues published in International Orthopedics found that larger herniations tend to resolve more completely and more often than smaller ones. That sounds backwards until you remember the mechanism. A bigger extrusion exposes more surface area to the immune system, giving macrophages more contact area to attach to and digest. Bigger leak, more surface, faster and more complete cleanup. If your scan shows a large herniation, that alone does not mean a worse prognosis. In some cases, it points toward a better one. That single fact, if someone had told it to me the week I got my own MRI, would have turned 6 months of anxious waiting into something closer to watching a known process play out on a known timeline. Now, if the disc material is being resorbed within months, why does pain sometimes last so much longer than that? And why do 2 people with what looks like the same size herniation report wildly different amounts of pain? This is where we need to separate 2 mechanisms that usually get lumped together as just the herniation. The first is mechanical. The physical mass of the leaked material presses on the nerve root, distorting the nerve fibers and disrupting the myelin coating that normally speeds up nerve signal conduction. The second is chemical, and it turns out to matter just as much, sometimes more. The nucleus material itself contains preformed inflammatory molecules, including tumor necrosis factor alpha and interleukins MOT and SAO, and research by Kang and colleagues published in the journal Spine confirmed these molecules sit ready inside the nucleus and activate the instant they contact vascularized tissue outside the disc. That explains something doctors see clinically all the time. Small herniations sometimes hurt dramatically more than large ones. A small leak releasing a concentrated dose of inflammatory chemicals directly onto a nerve root can cause more pain than a much bigger leak that happens to release less of that chemical soup. The pain has less to do with how much is physically pressing on the nerve and more to do with the concentration of inflammatory molecules bathing its surface. Tumor necrosis factor alpha specifically binds to receptors on pain-sensing nerve fibers in the nerve root and triggers a cascade inside the cell that increases production of ion channels responsible for pain signaling. More channels means a lower firing threshold, meaning stimuli that a healthy nerve would simply ignore now trigger a full pain signal. The nerve becomes hypersensitive to pressure, temperature, and chemical changes it would normally shrug off. Meanwhile, interleukin-1 and interleukin-6 recruit even more inflammatory cells to the area, which extends the irritation across the weeks the resorption process takes. This is why the ratio of mechanical to chemical pain varies so much between people, and why your friend's small herniation might have hurt far worse than your large one. So let's follow the nerve itself, because it has an entirely separate recovery clock from the disc, and this is probably the least understood part of the whole story. Once the compression is actually relieved, whether through resorption or surgery, the nerve does not instantly work again. The segment of the nerve fiber beyond the injury site first has to undergo something called Wallerian degeneration, where that damaged section essentially disintegrates, and the surrounding support cells, called squam cells, switch roles temporarily from maintenance crew to cleanup crew, clearing out the debris before anything new can grow. Once that's cleared, those same squam cells line up to form a guidance channel that a regrowing nerve fiber can follow, like a hallway pointing the way back to where it needs to go. Back at the nerve cell body, the cell shifts its internal machinery from a maintenance program into a growth program and sends a structure called a growth cone creeping down that channel. Here's the number that matters most for anyone waiting to feel normal again. That regrowth happens at roughly 1 millimeter per day, and this rate is not negotiable, because it's set by the physical speed of molecular motor proteins, kinesin and dynein, literally walking cargo down microtubule tracks inside the nerve fiber. Biology cannot speed this up. 1 millimeter a day works out to roughly an inch a month, or about 30 centimeters a year. If your herniation happened at the Launum-to-Smot level, the most common site for lumbar disc herniation, and your symptoms extend all the way down through the sciatic nerve into the foot, the total distance the nerve has to regrow can be close to a full meter. At that fixed rate, full recovery of sensation or motor strength in the foot can take 10 to 12 months after the compression is actually gone, months after your follow-up MRI shows the herniation itself has resolved. If you've had a disc heal on paper, but you're still dealing with numbness in the outside of your foot or weakness lifting your toes, you are not imagining things and you are not failing to heal. You are watching a nerve regrow at the only speed nerves are physically able to regrow. There's one more piece of this puzzle worth understanding, because it directly determines whether you help or sabotage your own recovery, and it comes back to how the disc actually eats. The disc has no blood vessels of its own anywhere inside it, so it has to get its nutrients through a completely different route called imbibition. Tin plates of cartilage cap the top and bottom of each disc, and tiny capillary buds from the vertebrae just beyond those plates carry oxygen, glucose, and amino acids that diffuse across the cartilage into the disc below. When you load the disc through standing or walking, compression squeezes waste-laden fluid out through those end plates. When you release the load by lying down or shifting position, the same osmotic pool from the proteoglycans we talked about earlier draws fresh, nutrient-rich fluid back in. Loading and unloading is the disc's circulatory system run by mechanical movement instead of a heartbeat. With age, those cartilage end plates gradually calcify, meaning calcium crystals build up and physically clog the pores nutrients need to pass through, right as the nucleus is separately losing water content because the proteoglycans that hold water start degrading. Heinz separate mechanisms degrading the same structure from opposite directions at once, which is a big part of why disc problems become so much more common after 50. Nucleus water content that sits around 80% at age 20 drops to somewhere around 60 to 70% past lumpy, meaning less hydraulic pressure, less even load distribution, and more direct stress landing straight on annular fibers that are simultaneously getting stiffer from age-related cross-linking, the same collagen stiffening chemistry that makes every connective tissue in your body less elastic as you get older. A stiffer, drier disc responds to load completely differently than a young one. Instead of absorbing energy through gradual elastic deformation the way it did at 25, it concentrates that same energy at its weakest point until that point fails suddenly, like an old rubber band that snaps instead of stretching. That's why the same load your back handled without a second thought at 30 can suddenly be the one at 55. The margin didn't disappear overnight. It had been shrinking for decades, and that ordinary lift simply happened to be the load that finally exceeded what was left of it. Now let's talk about what you actually do with all of this, because understanding the mechanism only matters if it changes your behavior, and here it changes it in some very specific, very counterintuitive ways. First, if you're in the recovery window after a herniation and someone tells you to go on strict bed rest, understand exactly what that recommendation costs you. Remember the imbibition pump we just walked through. Loading and unloading is what drives nutrients across the end plate and into the disc. Strict, prolonged bed rest removes that pump entirely. Without loading, imbibition stops. Without imbibition, the amino acids and oxygen your annular fibers need to actually synthesize new collagen for repair never arrive. This is exactly why modern spine rehabilitation has moved away from strict bed rest and toward early, gentle, pain-tolerant movement. Things like short walks and controlled flexion-extension motion that drive the pump without repressurizing the bridge. Movement within your pain limits isn't just tolerated, it is functionally part of the treatment, because it's the only thing feeding the tissue that's trying to heal. Second, once you understand that resorption follows a 3 to 12-month curve and that larger herniations often clear faster because of greater surface area exposure to your immune system, you can reframe how you interpret your own follow-up imaging. A shrinking herniation on a repeat scan isn't a lucky break. It's the expected biological outcome for the majority of cases, documented across multiple imaging studies. That doesn't mean you skip medical follow-up, but it does mean the waiting period between scans can be understood as an active healing process running on a predictable timeline rather than a black box of uncertainty. Third, separate your disc recovery from your nerve recovery in your own head, because conflating them is where most of the frustration and unnecessary worry comes from. If your imaging looks clean, but you still have numbness or weakness, don't treat that as a sign that something went wrong or that the herniation is coming back. Draw the simple math. Distance from the injury site to where you feel symptoms, divided by roughly 1 millimeter per day. That gives you a realistic timeline for nerve recovery, which is very often measured in months beyond the point your disc itself has already resolved. Knowing that number in advance turns lingering numbness from a red flag into an expected checkpoint on a known road. Fourth, know the actual red flags that override everything we just discussed, because the 75 to 80% resolution statistic does not apply universally, and this is not the part to get casual about. Loss of bladder or bowel control, numbness in the saddle region, or weakness in both legs together points to a large central herniation, compressing the nerve bundle below the spinal cord, called cauda equina syndrome, and that is a genuine surgical emergency requiring decompression within hours, not weeks. Similarly, progressive motor weakness that keeps getting worse despite weeks of conservative treatment, especially something like foot drop that isn't improving after 6 to 12 weeks, is a sign the nerve is being damaged faster than it can regenerate, and that calls for surgical evaluation rather than more patience. The physics we walk through explains the biology. It does not replace an actual physician examining you, and in these specific situations, waiting to see if the physics plays out on its own is the wrong call. So go back to that moment we started with. The pop, the fire down, the leg, the sudden inability to stand up straight. It felt like an event, a single catastrophic failure that came out of nowhere on an unremarkable Tuesday. But now you know what was actually happening under the surface. That moment was not the beginning of the story. It was the last page of a story that had been writing itself quietly for years, one microscopic tear at a time, in a structure engineered with the same logic as plywood and pressurized pipelines, feeding itself through a pump powered by your own footsteps, defended by an immune system meeting a piece of your own body for the first time and treating it, correctly, as something to clear away. The lift wasn't the cause. It was just the day the margin ran out. And the healing that followed wasn't something that needed to be forced or willed into happening. It was already underway, written into the biology, running on its own clock, whether anyone explained it to you or not. Next time something in your body seems to fail in an instant, ask yourself what decades of ordinary, unremarkable days might have been quietly building toward that single moment, because the real cause is almost never the day you noticed it.